Very kind introduction. It's a very nice pleasure to be here. Before I started my talk, I have a talk that targeting on broader audience, and it has two parts. One is science, and the other one is my home field, computer science, and these days AI and large language models very specifically. By large language models, I mean GPT-4 or GPT-5 by date, and also those coding agent or those kind of like a commercial level language models. I mean, so before I start, I want to do a little survey. So how many of you would categorize yourself as a natural scientist, like biologist, ecologist, physicist, chemist? Okay, not the majority. The other half, I would assume, is you're somehow computational, applied mathematician, physicist, computer scientist, engineers. Okay, statistician. Sounds good. Okay, that's interesting. You're less scientist, so I can say things more maybe boldly. That's out of my. All right, so I think we have a common. Maybe we have one thing in common that we all kind of like exposed to large language models. Wait, there's something blocking here. Okay, but now it's fine. Okay, yeah, I think it will disappear. So large language models. Well, I mean this by the web agent or the coding assistant, cloud, and all different grok that we've seen in social media. It's everywhere. Yeah, it's arguably changing our life in all different forms. That's great. So I don't think I have to convince you with that. So I want to ask a question. So when I was starting, so this is out of my main area. I usually don't study large language models, but there are just one type of probabilistic model I naturally draw into it, and it's changing the world. So it got me this interesting question to ask, do large language model understand science, right? Throughout this talk, I'll try to make things well-formulated as possible, as I'm a computer scientist by training. I like well-defined problems, but I'll start with some hand-wavy ideas, like by the words understand, which I cannot define. Yeah, so define directly. So the first one, there were, since the beginning of like ChatGPT came out, or GPT 3.5, people have doing this different types of evaluation. They've invited different types of scientists to evaluate, if it's danger to community, what tool, what problem, what task can perform, so on and so forth. But there are three main type of evaluation. The first part is expert evaluation. So you ask some scientists to sit there to work with it. Yeah, you can see, you're not expected to rate this, but you can see there's some literature review, coding development. This was evaluating on GPT-4 by the Microsoft AI for Science team. And you can see something related to experiment, something related to analysis, something related to more like atomistic operations, and something related to some precise computation. And you don't have to rate this because they don't even put a precise number. They put thumb up or crying face. So which means the evaluation is a little blurry, right? And sometimes works, sometimes doesn't work. Yeah, and that's what they reported essentially. Type 2, so you have, as scientists, we have a lot of computational and depending on the field and at least experimental database, we've seen something, the predictions, the phenomenon from nature that we've seen. So yeah, this is specific to something in chemistry and drug discovery. So there are a few things that computational database, they want to see, okay, if I ask language models through some prompt, do you know the property of this molecule? Do you know if this is going to be like a drug, or how much it's going to be like probability is going to be like a drug, right? So on and so forth. So just like through those databases, we have answer that we can directly query. And you can also see, they categorize the rank across different language models. But on the last column, they evaluate something like competitive, selectively competitive, accuracy, not competitive. This again suggests why don't you put some exact numbers? So it's kind of like roughly, you don't really know. But again, this results are from a year and a half, maybe 2 years, but some of the conclusions still holds. And the third one is from some computation exams, college level exams, or different sort of computations. I think this year especially that they have been cracking a lot of like very highly competitive exams in math, coding, and so on and so forth. But here, the challenges, I think around 2 years ago with the college entry level exams, and you can see a lot of, those numbers, I'm not sure how you feel about reading those numbers. Some are 50%, some are 20%, some are this category, some are that category, right? So this doesn't give me an absolute answer, like if language model knows science. But to me, I mean, I learn science from language model sometimes. I have to verify it with Wikipedia sometimes, but I do learn science from language model. But so clearly language model knows a lot of sense. So as a computer scientist, I want to find what's the right way to validate this and provide some evidence for this, right? So let me introduce my view of scientific discovery. So I work mostly in natural science. I study chemistry, sometimes physics and biological problem. And so the way I see science is like you start with some scientific inquiry. This can start with some of our natural intent to cure disease or something, or it can start with some our natural curiosity. We want to expand some phenomena we see in nature world. The problem can be very general, discovering some theories. We've seen some small phenomena in physics, for example, or we want to see some structures that our eyes naturally cannot see. We need some telescopes or I don't know, cryo-EM or mass spectral, like all different time machines to help us to see, what's there. And then also search some candidates for drugs for energy purposes or aerospace, anything like that. So when we start with scientific inquiry, we'll go into a loop. We first define a search space. What are the possible hypotheses? What do we want to, test on? What are the possible answers to our inquiry? And then next, we have to be able to validate hypotheses. They have to be validated. In reality, depending on what science you do, I think the most common one is experiments, or you make some perturbation. You change, some parameter to match to, what you intended to test your hypothesis, and you see the outcome. But even in social science, maybe things are harder. Like you cannot tweak humans sometimes. And then you do simulation or lab validation, or just wait, right? So until you see some evidence. And this helps us derive observables, right? So after we've seen these observables, we have some preference over our hypothesis space. So we know where to search over. So this is my narrow view of scientific discovery that I think is enough for this talk. So then the question comes in, right? So I want to say, I mentioned that like knowledge exists in large language model, and you can extract it in what is knowledge. And the second is like, how do we make sure it's not trivial, right? So if I ask language model, it just answers right away. Is that a knowledge? Or is that a knowledge that I'm trying to test? Or, is it going to be how much time you give it to run, just try to fix yourself and just give me a bunch of answers to match one of them, right? So as I said, large language models, I don't want to really expand what language model is, but inherently it's a probabilistic model. So a model with probability distribution, very high dimensional. When you give it some text prompts, some input, it spits out some outputs, right? And it's probabilistic, which means if you give it the same question a few times, you get different answers, right? So then I want to reshape the problem a little bit to make it more well-defined. So I don't want to talk about extract knowledge from large language models. I want to frame it as a search problem or optimization problem. We like it very much. That we have a hypothesis space that defined by the problem. And then we want to search over this hypothesis space. And the worst, if it's a discrete spaces, I have a lot of choices. That the worst case is just search over everything. Then I'll see what's the best answer available to me, right? So, but you search over the hypothesis space guided by some, here I call it oracle function that people use, but you can call it something that's verifiable, that can verify your answer to see if it's right or it's something better in terms of your problem. And this is a very well-defined problem that we study in operation research, computer science, and applied math maybe. And as I said, I study mostly chemistry problem, and I want to start with, I want to slightly build towards a few very concrete instances of those problems. The first problem I want to show is like, I want to find a drug. I want to find the molecules that I can represent as a string, so I can input to language model, and the language model can write it out. And I want to optimize it. So I want to guide over the space of the strings, some grammars, the space following some grammars. And I want to evaluate their properties and verify them. And I want to search over the space, right? How do I make sure it's non-trivial or optimal, right? So I have some baselines. I have some, classical algorithm that I can compare with. So given the same goal, same verifier, so I can have, many of the classical search optimization sampling algorithm that I know they're going to perform very well to work with something with set up the level that you should reach. So make sure it's not trivial. All right, and then what search algorithm, optimization algorithm we're going to use, right? So here's, you can certainly use a lot of them, but here we choose a simple one. Because it's naturally probabilistic models, because it samples from probability distribution, you can leverage the variance, the randomness, right? So which means if you sample a few answers, if you be able to select the good ones, so that's why not, right? So so the first thing we do is like, okay, then we take this problem, we set up a very simple, what's called evolutionary algorithm. How does work is it's inspired by natural evolution. It's like, when you have some good features, they're going to be selected through time if they're good. right? So the idea of translated to algorithm is that you have some candidate, you have a search space, you start with some candidates, and every time you rank your candidate, you keep the good candidates, and next time you random sample a few good candidates to give it to language model to ask it to generate something better, right? Hopefully, language model are gonna figure out that you should preserve this substructure or some part of this, some features from these good candidates to propose better candidates. That's the idea. So it's a very colorful figure that my collaborator draw. But I'm going to show you. So you have some initial samples. You can just, here you can see the value, maybe it's too small. Initial values here, the score is very low. So it's 0 to 1. And everything is around 0 0.01, 0 0.03. And you want to optimize something maybe up to 0 0.7 to be good. And you start with some initial samples. And you create a pool. And then you make some perturbation or sampling. You ask language models. You have two ways. You can take a molecule from this good set that you've collected. During initialization, that's the only set you have. And you ask the language model, say, okay, can you generate something? This is a reference. Can you generate something that would achieve the goal that I'm optimizing or the molecule I'm searching? Or you can do something, you can take two of them. You can do something called crossover. You give it two examples and say, okay, these two are good. Can you give me something better? And after you sample a lot of this, because you have verifier, you can verify all of the candidates that you've just sampled, right? So you can rank them and you keep the good ones because otherwise this pool is going to accumulating and you only want to keep good ones in the pool. You want to throw the bad ones in terms of score. And then you resample up to some probability, or you have very flexible way of resample for your next generation to just keep those good ones in your pool, right? So, and you just go through this iterative process until they converge. It's a very simple opposition algorithm inspired by nature. It's called evolutionary algorithm. Though it's simple, the results are pretty impressive at that time. This was also a paper that was from around a year and a half ago. It got published very early this year. So, as I said, there are a lot of classic algorithms. There were, 20, 25 of them, optimization, search, sampling algorithm, and there are a list of tasks people curated because, in chemistry, drug discovery, that was one of the first places people starting applying machine learning. So there are a lot of good resources accumulated here. So you can beat them very easily. And you don't even need GPT-4. So this was a GPT-4. It's not even today's GPT-5. I don't know how many generations after that. Like there's 4.0, 4.1, and 5, or so many. But 4 was kind of like very early, still in the history. And then you can also test it on. You don't have to have a pure like commercial level large language models. You can have some super small scale model specialized training for molecules, and you use that to search over that space and to ask it to give you better candidates, better designs of the molecules in terms of something you can verify. They also perform very well. And this is impressive. Maybe you don't work on this field, maybe you don't work in this field, but the people in this field would consider this very impressive. And this shows, before we're saying you should use this for those tasks, or if it's memorizing, as I said at the first place, I want to show that knowledge exists. So previously, people have not even been convinced that why you would have something that's hard to search that language model can output. Right? So if you can output it, that means you have searched it. And you can also look at the convergence have been converging decently, very, very, very fast, much faster than if you do the very basic evolutionary graph-based evolutionary algorithm. The same idea of the optimization process, but different operators instead of using, let's say, GPT-4. And you can see under the same budget, the larger models are going to do much better. And also, yeah, I don't see a lot of chemists here, but if you're a chemist, you're curious to see some of the molecules, here are they. All right, and also, sometimes you want to design some drugs that, for example, inhibitor to some functions or proteins. You want to optimize something. It's a cheap surrogate called docking score, measure like how well they could connect to each other and interact with each other. You can also do that. There are other, ways that you can use them because you can use language model as an optimizer, like search over the space. I would call them the knowledge inside the language model because it can output. And you can also starting with a byte pool. You want to keep using language model to searching better hypothesis through some bad hypothesis, just iterative refine hypothesis. Not iterative refine precisely, but iterative resampling. Yeah, because refine seems like you always keep everything you have. Resampling is like you throw the bad ones. Yeah. And also you can do multi-objective optimization. Here we demonstrated like you have 3 objective 5 objective, even some conflicting objective. You want to do some selective design. You don't want a molecule, you don't want a drug to inhibit all your proteins, right? So you want to inhibit a set of it. And you can see, you can draw the Pareto frontier, because the multi-objective optimization, especially when you have a conflicting objective, how do you make sure that you cover a wide range of Pareto frontier, the decision space that you would want? All right, so that was my first part. I have 3 main parts of the talk, and I want to, hopefully slowly impress you that, and building my argument on why I would argue that language model could, knowledge exists in language model, scientific one. And the second one I want to focus on slightly is related, but it's a quite different application in crystal structures. Like you want to discover some materials, right? So, and here the language model, okay, maybe you cannot see the language model here. So here the language, I put all the language model on the top right corner. You can see here we use Llama 3.1. And this is even an open source model. But it's still very good performance at the time, right? So, for small molecules, you might say, okay, it naturally can be, if you're a chemist, you know that it has a good grammar, you can represent it as strings. So language model have string on them. But what if you have something that naturally stored in files? And how do they look like? These are the crystal structures, but they don't store like this, like images, most of the time. So they're stored in this text format, right? So you're storing some of the how periodic structures formed in this crystal, some parameters, and then you store the coordinates over all your atoms. So it's another level. It's a 3D, so it stores everything floating point. You don't use 16 digits, but you may use something like you want to cut it to until 8, floating point 8, or even less. And it's highly symmetric, which means, if you break the symmetry, it would not result in a good material. And also, in the end, you would evaluate the validity if this material crystal structures are going to ever exist in nature, to check its energy. And it's very sensitive to error. And, if you break the symmetry. Okay, since there are not a lot of scientists, I'm going to just briefly explain, how do you define a stable material? Like, how do you, it's a very simple hypothesis, but it's kind of like it's a very complex problem to define what makes a material stable in nature. But it's just a simple one. So there's a database. It's either computational or experimentally curated. So it has a bunch of materials. They have some composition. Here you have 2 elements, A and X. So then you have A2X, A2X7 or something like that. So those are C materials and their energies, right? So if you see them in nature, you assume it's stable, right? And you assume that the convex hull, this database energy formed, are the upper bound of the energy can retain for a specific interpolation of those compositions, right? So the idea is that if you have some other fractional composition of this A and X, you're going to solve a linear programming problem, if you're familiar with that. Their energy composition, and if the energy that you checked, you've observed for this new material is below this convex hull, you would assume it's strictly below, you would assume it's stable. Yeah, if you don't get it, it's fine. It's just a way to define stable materials, I want to say. Yeah, and I don't think since there's no experts, I'll just drop those details. And again, okay, so sorry about attending a new figure style that's drawn by another collaborator. So you do the same evolutionary algorithm that I said. You start with some initial samples. You can take some samples that that from some very basic databases, materials project, for example. You start with those crystal structures. And then again, you take a large number of models. Here we use Llama 3.1. You don't need, by the way, you don't need to change anything from language model. You can do everything through chatting with language model. It's not really chatting. You just write a for loop, right? So until the iteration runs out, you evaluate the results. And then you calculate the weight. You evaluate if the energy, if they're stable, so on and so forth, things that you care about the materials. And then you resample. And then you iterate the loop, right? So the same procedure as I showed before. Just drawn in the different styles, and a bit of extra things you should take care of because you're dealing with this more complex crystal structures. So the key difference here is that at the first place, what you had was like a simple string, but here you have you still have a string, but the string is more stringed because this string encodes floating points. It has some of the coordinates that are tokenized into digits, and thought and stuff, right? So it's kind of like quite impressive that if this thing could work. That was my impression. I would just test, okay, if you have knowledge about the screens that you may seen during your training, how about something I would bet maybe you've not seen that much, right? So, and it turns out, okay, so since you don't work on this field, no worries about the numbers. So the one thing I want to highlight here is like, you can check the stability, and this is checked by density functional theory calculation. It's the quantum, the very basic quantum level calculation that we treat as some good standard that you've seen. You compare to previous models that specialized training on this task, that leverage the geometry, the symmetry of this task, that specialized model. You can actually perform yeah, fairly better than them, right? So I don't want to argue that you should use this for material discovery, but these results were impressive to me and the people in the field. And also the next question are you going to ask is that, when you evaluate the stability and so on and so forth, of course, language, we did one thing that was tricky. It's not a trick, but it's a little tricky, is that we have to relax the energy because as I said, the energy is very sensitive to noise and errors. Yeah, when you have when language model predicts something that does not form exact symmetry, you may want to relax it a little bit to make sure it's followed the structure. And here is say that, how much that relaxation helps. And in practice, if you look at, the delta E is that, most of them need to, or half of it, it doesn't help that much, right? So, but for the rest of them, I just want to show that it's not entirely that thing helps. Language model already has some knowledge to generate some stable structures. That's the point I'm trying to make. And of course, something you can do is like, we have some wonderful collaborator who was, around the group of materials project that everyone uses computational database. And that we know that around time to time that people have find experimentally better structures about certain composition of materials. And we took one of them that we for sure knew that it was not the optimal one for a material project. And we used the same, workflow to say, okay, let's find the crystal structure would be. Can we find something better, right? So, and yeah, the answer is yes. So you can find something better than the computational database. And also, of course, if you care about design, you care about optimization, you can also do multi-objective optimization as seen before. You want to design some harder materials, you want a higher bulk modulus, one property that relates to hardness. And also material has to be stable, has to, have to be able to make it. And also, we also break this down to see, okay, which part kind of like, contributes most to the performance. And there are a few things, right? So you don't have to read the figure for now. Maybe just read the bullet points that I'll walk you through one by one. So, because there are two procedures we have here, right? An initial pool, and the other is like if you take an iteration. Right here, what we do is like we want to say, okay, if we turn everything off, right? We just do zero-shot prompt. By zero-shot, I mean just ask the language model, give me a crystal structures, right? So if you just evaluate this way, it's like you don't have any reference structure, you don't have a pool, you don't have an iterative procedure. Then you can see the results like, is this? I don't know this color. This color is too similar. And then it's almost no stable structure. So most of it are above zero, right? So which means if you just direct prompt, it doesn't work. Yeah. And so the second is like, if you don't put any reference structure, you just do iterative prompt, then you would converge to very, it works, but you would converge to a very small space. The diversity would collapse if you go into the structure generated. If you only do the reference, if you only give it a reference structure, but you ask the language model, so given those reference structure, give me new materials, give me new crystal structures, it would result in less structure. The generation performance are fine, but you get much less structures. Maybe they're repeated and some of them are invalid. And you would have to do, keep this pool, you do this evolutionary algorithm, you just iterative search that gives you the best performance, essentially. All right. Any question about second part? Or the first part? Yeah, go ahead. Previous state as reference, or is it just like? Oh, okay. Yeah. By ref here, we mean initial reference. But each state you always produce, since you do iteration, you always provide some reference from the last pool. Here, I mean that if you want to give some existing materials as reference to language models. But you only give it for iteration and good question. So here it means like if you do a warm up or a cold start. you start with, by no ref, it means even the first iteration, it starts with what language model can output. But if you said yes with ref, that means you start with some already good materials. Yeah, so that barely can make it converge faster, maybe cover diverse space. Diverse space. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, all right, cool. All right, then the last part. The last part is another interesting problem. It's different. It's different. It's also quite challenging, and I would say even more challenging. But it's also very different in nature of the problem. It's called retrosynthesis planning. So, what does retrosynthesis planning means? Mathematically or computationally, is a sequential decision-making procedure. Let's say the goal is to synthesize this target molecule. I want to get this molecule. How do I do? I want to break this down into steps. I want to start with something smaller unit. Maybe I can buy it, or I can even find in nature, right? So then I take a few synthesis steps to assemble them, and then get the output, and then play this Lego stuff blocks, and then in the end I get my target molecule. And how do we know? How can we what block we can plug together? There's a reaction database. So there are just like some pluggers that you can plug in on the left-hand side, the reactant, and this is simplified, of course, grammar, and the output, the product. And there's you can look it up online. There's a purchasable database that you can buy, the molecules you can buy. Or you can maybe, even if you want to do it further, you can check those molecules you can order on demand from some synthesis companies and stuff. And it's a sequential, you can probably already see the sequential decision-making structure, right? So you want to give a target, you want to see how do I break down this step by steps, which each step I can only take some actions. And then after I take these actions, I know the output. I want to check if the output is in some predefined set. If it's predefined set, I just throw it. It's a tree search if you are in computer science, if you think about it, right? So, and if it's not, then I keep expanding it. Right? So I can do a depth first search or breadth first search, for example. And how do they look? So in reality, we play with two ways to do it. First one is because the tree is a nested structure. I mean, in language model, when you play with nested structures, what you do is like you do a JSON file, right? So, but here you have a multiple layers JSON, which arguably language model may not see a lot during the training. I would argue. And also you can break down those tree steps. You can just make it parallel, which keep each individual steps to make it more like a linear structures, linear growth. And how people approach this classically, as I said, it's naturally a search problem. And what people do is like, you can set up your own heuristics, and then you use the search algorithm. Use your heuristic to have the search algorithm. And the search algorithm, if you use the exhaustive search, if you wait infinite time, I think eventually you'll find it, depending on the complex, if the problem has a solution, depending on how hard the problem. But in reality, of course, you want to stop at a certain budget. You don't want to wait forever. And here, what does NM-based heuristics, like people train a neural network to predict what's the next action to take? I would just assume neural network, some machine learning models prediction. And so when we work on this, I thought about, okay, maybe there are two strategies to do this. Or originally, I thought only one strategy. One strategy is like it's very naturally to replace this heuristic or human heuristic or neural network heuristic with a large language model heuristic. Just replace that part, right? So I still use the search algorithm, but just replace who provides the heuristics. Or there's another strategy. It's more bold, I would say. Is that I don't even think about this step-by-step search. I just generate the whole thing together, the whole path, instead of step-by-step. It turns out, if you plug in language model as a single step search, that it works very bad. Especially, for the easy problem is fine, but easy problems only have, direction breakdowns, only like 3 to 5 steps, which is very, very short. And for the pistachio hard, for the rest of the last 2 columns, they are like 7 to 10 steps, which makes it much more challenging. And for those cases, if you just do single step language model with different type of search, MCTS is Monte Carlo tree search. retrostars is a variant of A-star search if you're computer science. And what we eventually do is that it doesn't outperform baseline for sure. And baselines are strong because if you give it enough search budget, search algorithm works. And Okay, again, a different style, but same idea, right? So we want to generate the whole reaction paths together in the linear format of the JSON file. Right? So what we do here is that, okay, we can start with some reference, reaction database, but of course we cannot give it the reaction route for the exact molecule we're trying to synthesize. We may give it to something close to it, or even arbitrary one. I'll show you. That's magical. And here we are using more like state of the art, GPT-4o. It's a very expensive one if you play with language model APIs sometimes. Um, and you start with some initial samples from the reference, for example. I'll talk about how do we do reference later. And then you make some perturbation. You want to change some part of the reactions that you get invalid. Because when you generate this whole thing, there are a lot of parts that can get invalid, right? So you want to make some perturbation. But the next thing is important, right? So because you have more like a 0-1 thing, because this is a search problem. Either you search solution or you do not search a solution. You know, in machine learning world, this means the reward is so sparse. It's either 0 or 1. You don't get meaningful learning signals. And what did we do was, you know, that's also the interesting part of this. You can throw in all heuristics. We had, you know, there was commonly used heuristics of how synthesizable a specific compound is. You just take that simple heuristic and take it to all the molecules to use this as a weight, to early weight, to filter out. Let's say, you know, how bad is this? It only gives you a trend. It doesn't even agree on the optimality, right? If this says it's a perfectly good molecule, in reality may not be. The search may not stop, which in reality would cause issue in the end. But initially, it greatly accelerated, you know, the search process to get out the super wrong solution, to get to some decent solution. And again, you resample, keep the good ones from your pool. And then, you know, with this, actually, you know, okay, I call it DAG because this retrosynthesis path is directly a cyclic graph. So with this, generating this whole reaction pathways, I actually match the performance of state-of-the-art search algorithm with neural network-based heuristics. And there was even some follow-up work recently. What they told me is like they can even get better, which they replace our evolutionary algorithm with again a tree search, Monte Carlo tree search. But it's still the same idea following how we handle this. And that was pretty impressive because I've worked on those problems. So it's pretty hard to solve. And now I want to talk about a few important design choices, right? So the first one is like, you know, what type of what's the root type that we choose? For example, if we are going to represent things by the tree that I showed or the sequential structure. And turns out if you use a tree, the performance was pretty bad. I think that's kind of reasonable. When here, I mean, bad or good, there's a percentage that usually differ by 30%, you know. But maybe sometimes in some papers you've seen something, you know, depends on the task. But usually tuning parameter can always make things like, you know, 5%, I mean, 1 or 2% off at least. But here, you know, it's differ quite a lot. It's a 30%. And the next thing is like, you know, I said that you have a pool here, right? So, but you don't have a pool like before. So now, so previously you have some other crystal structures or molecules that are good. But here, what does the pool mean, right? So you want to find a path to synthesize one molecules. Does the pool means that you already have other paths to synthesize this and you want to make it shorter or something, right? You want to make it save some money or something, but it's not. It's just like having a target molecule that you want to synthesize, some similarity to the other molecules and take that. And then when we do ablation study, something very interesting happens is that, you know, with some retrieved root, usually the similarity, I mean, this is a discrete space. I just want to give you some sense. It's around 0.3 to 0.4 similarity over the scale of 0 to 1, which means they are almost not so similar. It's discrete space. And, you know, when we even, but that helps. And then what we do is like, you know, when we remove this, the performance drops significantly. And what we do is like, okay, since the similarity are so low, what if we just do random roots? We just give it arbitrary roots, right? So, and that also helps. That helps you know, it seems like that's the most gain to know the format. Yeah, I think this aligns with some people, you know, in language model literature, they do this in context learning. If you give it a few structure of the problems, you can solve the problem better. But essentially, the way I see it is just like it triggers some places that are with greater similarity to the problem. So that's it gets answered better. And also with only this partial reward, with only final reward, sparse reward 0, 1, as I mentioned, yes or no, when you get to larger roots that almost doesn't help, it breaks because it's super challenging. And with this partial reward, it also again, it improves 50% on the second one. And also, the last thing, which is the least important, I would say, is like you can always do prompt engineering, but that's not something, I mean, there's something great that you can always gain something by doing it, right? But it doesn't give you the most gain. And if you do different types of prompt engineering that people would do, that helps. Yeah. And of course, like you can go from the target down to the bottom to where you start. You can also try to construct the target and then you want to construct the target with certain property that you want. So that one the first one I would expand as top down. You start with a target, go down to the bottom, but now you can do bottom up. You can construct things step by step to your target. The good thing about this is like you can have some selectivity on your target, right? So and it goes both ways. And people usually distinguish this as the first one was like, giving us fixed target, find the way to break it down. The second one is like, the goal is to find a good target, but not a fixed target, but also prefix the way that such that you can construct. And you can do the same. And, I don't want to say a lot, but essentially I want to argue that it works. Also, it works. And if there are some chemists you want to look at, I didn't show a very simple root. I didn't show a very complex root here, but this is, for example, one of the roots that's only 2 steps that the language model find. At the same time, optimize some properties of the target. Find something that you'll be able to construct with good property. All right. So we also, apply this to if there are biology like protein sequence design and transition metal complex and other types of materials search, and L has great performance. Yeah. So that's almost the technical part of the talk. I want to just wrap up with a few reasons that I have in mind why this worked. Because to me, this was quite mysterious. And initially it was quite counterintuitive that people claim it doesn't work, which is counterintuitive to me because clearly, you learn from language models sometimes. And I want to say, okay, then, what's the right way to quantify this? Or maybe not the only right way, but at least one right way, right? But the challenge of this whole laser project was that it's very easy to argue that you found something that's just found it, right? So you just show that it has great performance, but it's hard to argue that when you don't find something, it's hard to argue if it was the wrong way or you cannot, just fundamental limitation. So that was the very rewarding part of this, that I get to understand large language model better, and I really more into this and into controlling this into a more well-formulated way. And yeah, I mean, the first thing, I don't want to argue so strongly. I don't want to argue that you should use this right away, but at least I want to give you some impression, right? With the right amount of, with the right way, you can extract things that are very hard to find, some knowledge in science from large language model. Of course, you can further twin it or further train it, or people call it fine tuning, and that also helps further improve. And why would it work? Yeah. I mean, I don't want to treat the language model as humans, to be honest. I like to treat it as probabilistic models. They are sampler. They parameterize some high-dimensional probability distributions. I want to understand what distribution they are sampling from, and how do we push that distribution towards the places that we care about. And why does it work? It's if you think about language model trained on massive data, but if you really think about it, even on a single domain, molecules, we've never, well, maybe some people have done, but they have not open source. We've never exhaust all the data we have, right? But possibly they are exhausted in language models. I mean, the only thing is like there are also other things in language model, but that's double-edged sword. It's good and bad, right? So do we still have to train specialized foundation models? If you already be able to train a super large model, though with a lot of other things mixed, but it can memorize everything, right? So it doesn't, previously, there was in machine learning, there was a research topic called catastrophic forgetting. So when the machine learning model gets training over and over more things, you forget what you've learned. If you test some early task that you trained on, you forget, right? So it seems like a language model, I mean, I'm not tested systematically, but seems when you break the data scale and the commute scale, it seems to getting better. And also it has learned logic patterns from code and math, like people have been arguing from this, arguing for those problems. And also, though it's not interpretable, you cannot exactly understand its thought. I mean, if you're trying, then, but again, it has some general conversational capability. That's at least something that you can extract from chat. So interpretability has different level of, has different levels, right? All right, so that was my personal reasoning of why large language model would ever worked, and I thought it makes sense. And in the end, and then some questions I care about and outlooks. Then the question is like, what is the limit of language model, large language model? The reason why I test on those problems was like they are computationally verifiable, and they are hard problems. They are well-defined problems, so I can compare with something that I know are good, right? And but what are their fundamental limits, right? So when you challenge language model with the hardest problem, you would see some of the limit. For example, for some of the search problem, we do see at some point language model are not being able to propose any candidates, which means that's kind of like the boundary they've been trained, which is nice, right? So it feels safer. We'll feel you can control them or they have boundaries, right? And the second one is like, through the history, like, maybe instead, previously how people use machine learning was like define a bias distribution. Because I cannot construct, or not everything is of my interest across science or even a specific science problem, right? So I construct only the data set specific to my task. And I define a bias distribution and I train those things on this. But now it seems like if you already have a general model, the only thing you need would be define the verifier, right? So define how to verify answer, and then just iteratively search through a huge model, and then just have a very fast verifier to verify if the hypotheses are right or reliable, or so on and so forth. Different levels of verifier. And also, what's interesting in the machine learning sense is like previously people kind of like tokenize. We want to tokenize things in the most natural way. For example, model a crystal structure, model something with symmetry, high degree of symmetry. We want to use the most natural way that respect those symmetries. But now it seems like you can tokenize everything by just digits. And it's quite interesting that why is the case. And what does tokenization even mean if we tokenize something, right? So, and the last thing is like, not the last thing I have, I think maybe two more in the next slides. So interpretability is like, how do we leverage those search routes to visualize what's inside language model space, project this to a low dimensional space such that we can understand better. There's some field called mechanistic interpretability, or some physicists, some people trying to understand this always. And what are the reasoning capabilities? I try to avoid the word reasoning. If you've seen some of the news and everything's like about language model, they use reasoning a lot. I hope that I didn't use a lot of reasoning here, because reasoning, I don't know how to define reasoning very properly mathematically. I can define optimization. I have a goal, search, right? So decision making, or even constraint satisfaction. But I don't know how to, what does reasoning mean? It's kind of like something that binds to like human, or hints to a human, right? So do they build a huge semantic rich embedding that are, when you through some random structure of the problem, you already kind of like locate to some region and just starting search there, and condition on those probabilities, just starting function as a normal probability model? Could be. I haven't verified this hypothesis. And how this leads to other things, right? So like the coding agent, web agent, this is totally independent of that. How do you do multi-agent, right? So how do that's kind of like I want to, I'm a very classical scientist, so the way I'm thinking about it is I want to hold it off to, to things that I know, and then I want to open it up. But there are a lot of people more like top down. Like say, okay, let's imagine how amazing that we could replace something human labors by language model. Let's do that. There's a huge market, right? So there are a lot of people thinking about that sometimes, and yeah. And then what are the fundamental capabilities that we were thinking about we can achieve with further tuning it, right? So right now, so far, what I've been talking about was not changing the parameter at all, but just sampling, inference with it, talking to it. And but when you start want to changing its parameters, how do you make sure you are fine-tuning some fundamental capability or not make it collapse to a specialized model? Right. The last point, right? So there's always a difference between formal science and natural science. So this may not be the good definition, but it's from Wikipedia. Formal science means mathematics, logic, computer science, where or it comes from axioms and you derive it, everything, you build everything. And then natural science means something with much greater uncertainty, where you have to make observations, then you decide your next move, right? So before you're making observations, you take your guess and take the actions. You don't know where's next to go, right? That's also very different. If you want to really ever use this into natural science, you have to take into the effort to account for the greater uncertainty, and also on the other side of the coins, the beauty of curiosity that drives human, right? All right, yeah. I mean, all the codes are available, and if you want to play with, you may want to have some API calls to ChatGPT